Hey World War II class, Mr. Sharon here. So last time we talked about the early war in the Pacific. Now we're going to move on to the war for Europe and North Africa. We're going to focus in on what the United States was doing early on in the European side of things. Because obviously right after Pearl Harbor, we know that the United States engaged in combat against the Japanese in the Pacific. But obviously, eventually, we would also get involved in the fight against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. All right, so the first thing that would be important to know is something that was going on over in the European front. At the same time, the United States was in a very heated battle against Japan in the Pacific. Was Nazi Germany had decided to pretty much break their non-aggression pact against the Soviet Union. Hitler didn't trust Stalin, he didn't trust communists. After the failed Battle of Britain, once Hitler realized that Germany wasn't in a position yet where they could take over the United Kingdom, he decided to turn his focus on the Soviet Union. So in the summer of 1942, the Germans take Stalingrad, which is one of the major cities in Russia, obviously named after Joseph Stalin, renamed once Stalin became the dictator there. So it would seem like this was a good thing for the Germans, but the problem with Germany is that they didn't really follow through with the plan. So it's great that they were able to take over the city. That's, good for your military, but when you do that and you don't really have what's next to your plan, that's going to be an issue. So what happened is the Soviets launched a winter counterattack. So the Germans had control of the city, but they were cut way off from their supply lines. And eventually, after being surrounded by Soviet soldiers, they had no choice but to surrender. Otherwise, they were all going to starve to death or be killed through invasion. So the Battle of Stalingrad is considered the turning point of World War II in terms of the European side of things, because that's when the momentum began to shift against Germany. You saw the Soviets push Germany back further and further and further until eventually the United States got involved in the war and Germany was surrounded in Berlin and had to surrender. On the Pacific side of things, once again, the turning point was the Battle of Midway, for a similar reason, because from that point on, the United States began to push Japan back and back and back and further back to the east. I have some videos here. All right, so Battle of Stalingrad, and this is really important because it's kind of like history repeating itself. If you've ever taken a world history class, you might have heard of Napoleon and his French Empire. Napoleon tried to do something similar. He pretty much had a grip over all of Europe, and then he decided that he wanted to launch an attack into Russia. The mistakes he made is he got his men cut off too far from their supply lines, and it was winter, so the cold set in. There was food shortages, very similar to what happened to Nazi Germany in the Battle of Stalingrad. So from November 1942 to May 1943, right after and kind of coinciding with the events of the Battle of Stalingrad, you had Operation Torch. So with Operation Torch, we saw the United States start to get involved in the European front in terms of having ground soldiers. So up until this point, and we'll actually go back and revisit this, we were doing some naval battles, some naval engagement against the Germans mainly. But as far as land invasions went, as far as putting soldiers on the ground, at this point in history, up until this point, it had all been against Japan in the war in the Pacific. So this saw a shift where the United States started to put soldiers on the ground, and this was all in North Africa. North Africa had been controlled by the Axis powers. We already know that Italy controlled some territory in North Africa, what we would call modern-day Libya, that had dated back well before World War II. And we also know that they had taken over Ethiopia and some of the surrounding areas. So future U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower was the main commander of this front of the war. Douglas MacArthur was the main commander of the war in the Pacific. So Eisenhower commanded an invasion of Axis-controlled North Africa. And all you really need to know about this one is it was very effective. So the Axis powers had to surrender control after roughly 6 months of fighting. A couple of reasons why we did this instead of invading Europe. We knew that North Africa wouldn't be as heavily as defended as mostly Nazi-occupied Europe. We also knew that in North Africa, a lot of the fighting would be against Italian soldiers, and the belief was that the Italian military was not up to par with the German military, even though we did still have a lot of fighting against Nazi Germany in North Africa as well. But for those reasons, we figured it would be an easier kind of start to this European front than just trying to go right into Europe and take it back from the Nazis. Mid-1943, so the reason we kind of do it in this order is we're looking at when things ended. So victory in the Battle of the Atlantic goes all the way back to really right after Pearl Harbor. We started to get involved in this. So this was that naval engagement I was talking about. So in December 1941, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, convinces Roosevelt that Germany and Italy posed a bigger threat than Japan. That's probably not totally accurate. I didn't totally convince Roosevelt that those two posed a bigger threat, but he gave his best effort, and I would say at any length, Churchill was able to convince Roosevelt that Germany and Italy posed a threat, and that we should get involved to some extent, even though the majority of our fighting for the foreseeable future at that point was going to be against Japan in the Pacific, because they had attacked us, they had actually taken territory from us, which Italy and Germany hadn't done yet. So in early 1942, Hitler had blockaded Britain and the Soviet Union through the Atlantic Ocean and sunk many Allied ships. So what did we do? We decided we were going to help to break that blockade, because once we had war against Japan, Britain and the Soviet Union would be our natural allies. So how do we help out? Well, just like in World War I, where we had all these military ships that would surround cargo or trading ships. These were groups that traveled together called convoys. We used the same strategy in World War II. This time they were much more effective. In World War I, convoys weren't always able to get our trading ships across the Atlantic Ocean safely. They would still be sunk by German subs. The difference here is we had new equipment. We had sonar, which you can send radio waves down through water, underneath the water, and you could detect objects that are there that are not visible to the eye. You could see how quick they're moving, roughly how large they are, and you could fire torpedoes and take out those targets. We didn't have that in World War I. The other thing is, if you have a convoy of ships out in the ocean, they're obviously going to be vulnerable to an air raid. You need a couple planes to fly over and drop a couple, missiles on your ships, and that's it. So with radar, you would have airplanes that would join the convoy system, and they would fly nearby, and radar would send radio signals through the air to detect planes, enemy planes, that could be miles away and not visible yet, but you could see that they were coming. You could roughly see how many there were, and you can launch an attack before they could reach the ships. So for these reasons, sonar and radar, new technology, you really see this work much more effectively than even in World War I. The other thing we did, which we did in World War I, is we ramped up our ship production. So by early 1943, the United States began producing 140 Liberty ships each month. And that's where we reached the break-even point where we could launch more of these things. We could launch them faster than they could be sunk. And these were big ships. As you can see from the diagram here, 441.5 feet roughly. These were mostly to carry men and supplies over to the war effort in Europe. You would find these usually on the inner part of the convoy surrounded by military ships. June 6, 1944, we have D-Day. So D-Day, it was part of a bigger operation called Operation Overlord. So what we need to know about this is the Battle of the Atlantic. We were able to break the blockade. Battle of Stalingrad, that was a big victory for the Allies because the Germans started to get pushed back. Operation Torch, we took back North Africa from the Axis powers. So at this point, we were getting a good handle also over on the war in the Pacific against Japan. And we decided that the time was right to launch an invasion to free Europe, especially that western part of Europe. So we look at France primarily, from Nazi rule, because the Nazis had taken over almost all of Europe and they had been in control of it for years. So Operation Overlord was commanded by Dwight Eisenhower once again, and this was to go back and take France and the rest of Western Europe. So what we did is we gathered roughly 3 million British, American, and Canadian soldiers in England. If you were to look at a map, you're right across the English Channel. You have kind of a strong foothold there. You can just travel your soldiers across and engage the Nazis and try to break into continental Europe. So the plan was to attack Normandy, France, which is a section of beaches, which you can see right here. So June 6, 1944, this was the first phase of Operation Overlord. It's called D-Day, and it involved paratroopers who were dropped behind German enemy lines on the beaches in the nighttime hours. They were dropped a couple miles behind the lines. And then in the early morning hours, at the same time when you would have these paratroopers dropped behind the beaches on land, you would have men coming up doing a seaborne invasion, wading through the water. So if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, this is shown really well in that film. The first roughly 25 minutes to a half hour of the film show the D-Day invasion. So one of the reasons this was so successful is due to the fact that there were paratroopers coming from the back. If it was just a bunch of guys wading through the water against German machine guns on the beaches, it would have been a slaughter. We would have had no chance to take back the beaches and get into Europe. But the fact that we were able to surround the German machine gunners on the beaches, that's why we were able to take them back. It cost heavy casualties, just like the Battle of Stalingrad cost very heavy casualties for the Soviet Union. This resulted in very heavy casualties for the US, Canada, and the UK, with also some assistance from some French fighters. So within a month, the Allies had landed 1 million soldiers and supplies in France, so we were back in continental Europe and we were ready to take on mainly the Nazis. So once we got in there, things started happening really quick. We saw the liberation of the first major concentration camp, the liberation of Majdanek. So we have some pictures here of what was found by the Allies, and this was uncovered by the Soviet Union because the Soviets were pushing from the east. And if you look at a map of where the concentration camps were, most of the extermination, the death camps, were on the Polish side of things, and that's where the Soviets were pushing, where the US and the UK and Canada to some extent were pushing from the other side. So Up until this point, there were a couple camps that had been uncovered by the Soviets with really no evidence of anything happening. That's because SS guards had burned evidence, they had buried bodies. Before the Soviets could get to camps, they evacuated the camps, moved prisoners to other camps, just tried to eliminate any evidence of the atrocities of the Holocaust. Because it's one thing if people die in war, if enemy, soldiers are fighting each other and combatants die, that's one thing. But there's rules of war. You don't kill prisoners of war. You don't kill civilians. And obviously, the Nazis were guilty of all these things. So they tried to hide all the evidence, but with Majdanek, the Soviets started pushing in so fast, they didn't have time to hide any of the evidence anymore. And one of the reasons for that is because when the rest of the Allies launched D-Day and got a foothold in Europe, now the Germans had to fight a war on both sides, so it allowed the Soviets to push in much quicker than they had been. There's a memorial today at Majdanek. Maybe you ever visit. A lot of these camps you are able to visit. August 1944, the liberation of France. So it doesn't take long. So about 2 months after D-Day. Now we talked about Eisenhower being the main commander. One of the main leading generals under Eisenhower was George Patton, who was on the ground responsible for a lot of the fighting that was done with tank divisions. So George Patton is given a lot of the credit for the strategy of liberating the French. And also when we were able to free France from Nazi rule, that was really good news for FDR because it looked like we were making big progress in the war, and FDR was elected to a 4th term as president, which is the record. No other president was elected for more than 2 terms. And because the Constitution was changed with the 22nd Amendment, it's unlikely we'll ever see another president elected 4 terms. It's a really good video here if you want to see a clip from a movie about George Patton. And you see some pictures of what was going on in France afterwards. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French movement. So when France was chased out of their country, a new government was set up in exile over in the United Kingdom. And it was agreed that a former war hero of World War I, for the French, Charles de Gaulle, he would be the new leader of France if and when the Allies were ever able to go in and take it back. One of the darker parts about World War II, which you don't really hear about the Allies doing bad things, was when the Nazis were chased out, it was uncovered that there were a lot of women who had relationships with the occupying Nazi soldiers, and some of them had children with these Nazi soldiers. These were French women. So they were kind of viewed as traitors to their country, and they were uncovered and they were humiliated out in public, stripped down, had their heads shaved. Was that really the right thing to do? I'm not so sure. October 1944, capture of Aachen. So this is significant because all the fighting to this point had been done in territory that Germany had taken. We were just trying to take territory back from Germany. With the capture of Aachen, this was the first time we fought within the old borders of Germany and had taken a town that used to belong to Germany before the war. So no longer was this about trying to take territory back from Germany. This was just trying to take Germany back from the Nazis. So strategy has shifted. Aachen was on the German Siegfried Line. So you might remember we talked about the Maginot Line, which was a system of military fortifications that the French had set up to protect themselves from a German invasion. Well, the Germans had set something up that was kind of similar, called the Siegfried Line. Very similar to how Germany was able to break through the Maginot Line and kind of surprise France. We were able to break through the Siegfried Line at a point where Germany didn't really think we'd be able to. So that was near Belgium and the Netherlands. Some pictures of the Maginot Line. Sorry, the Siegfried Line, pretty similar to what you saw on the Maginot Line. It was meant to slow down a military. These would be meant to prevent tanks from rolling through the area. So at this point, the Germans are on the ropes. They lost their foothold in France, then they lost all of France. They're getting pushed back on the other side by the Soviets. Concentration camps are being uncovered. The Battle of the Bulge is considered the last real strong effort by the Germans to try to fight back and try to launch an offensive and get the Allies on the ropes. So it lasts a couple months through the winter of 1944 and 1945. And they were able to break through Allied defenses. You can kind of see it on this map. Everything in the orange is where they were able to push back the Allies. At this point, it would mainly be the US with some UK assistance. So they pushed us back 80 miles along a 60-mile front. Or actually, let me see if I'm saying that right. They pushed us back, it looks like 80 miles along a 60-mile front, creating this kind of bulge in the line. It wasn't successful because they were never able to break through the line. So what they wanted to do is break through our line of soldiers and surround us, kind of encircle us on the north and the south, and they were never able to accomplish that. We did suffer our most casualties in the war, trying to stop the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge. 89,000 American soldiers suffered some kind of casualty. And I believe out of those, I could be a little off, but I'm pretty sure it was around 20,000 of those were fatalities. The Germans eventually lost too many soldiers and supplies, and they retreated for the rest of the war. So this was their last big attempt to try to do something drastic in World War II. Let's talk about really quick what was going on in the Italian campaign. So in the summer of 1943, the Allies invaded Italy and they took Sicily. So even before D-Day happened, we did launch an invasion of Southern Europe, once again for the reason that it seemed like the Italians would be an easier opponent to take on at the time than the Germans because of their weaker military, and we were right. So the United States actually took over the southern part of Italy, and Italy split into two separate countries for a while for the last part of the war. The north was called the Italian Social Republic. Mussolini, who had originally been arrested and then broken out of prison by SS members of the Nazis, that's a whole story of its own you can look into, became the leader of northern Italy. We say he was a puppet leader because we understand that at this point Hitler was really calling all the shots. And in the south, they set up their own government called the Kingdom of Italy, which had a strong alliance with the Allied powers. That's the side they were on. So Italy really had kind of a civil war going on. You had northern Italians and southern Italians fighting against each other for the rest of the war. Hitler sent a lot of soldiers into Italy to try to put up a resistance. He didn't want to see the northern part fall to the Allies. By 1945, with Nazi Germany surrounded on both sides, further north by the Soviets on one side and then mainly the US and the UK on the other, and now you had Allied soldiers in the south, down in Italy. It was just too much for them to continue to resist. So northern Italy ended up falling. In the spring of 1945, Mussolini, who is second from the left, was captured trying to escape with his mistress, who is third from the left. They were executed and then they were hung out in public. Just to give the people an idea of this is what happens when you try to form a dictatorship over your people, and then you get them in a war they don't want to fight, and then you lose. So just beware. Word of warning. May 8th, we just celebrated the anniversary pretty recently, just a little over a week ago. 75 years. So May 8th, 1945 is VE Day, known as Victory in Europe Day. On April 25th, the Soviets had launched an invasion of Berlin, the German capital. Just a couple notes here. Hitler had a long-running mistress named Eva Braun. They committed suicide together 4 days after the Soviet invasion. And mainly because they didn't want to get caught, because they knew that would be really bad. The consequences for any Nazi officials was probably going to be the death sentence. A week later, General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich. So, May 8th. So there it is. That's Victory in Europe Day at this point. All we'd really have to worry about was finishing off the Japanese in the War in the Pacific. And we'll be looking at that later on. Kind of interesting because if you remember from the non-battle deaths assignment we did, where you saw all the people who died in the different countries, because of prisoners of war, civilians, the Holocaust. You might have noticed that the Soviet Union had a very high fatality count. Because of that, when the Nazis surrendered, they were given orders not to surrender to the Soviet side. They were given orders to run in the opposite direction and surrender to the US side of things, because they thought the United States might have a little more sympathy or a little more mercy on them. A couple of things to keep in mind. So before VE Day, so Franklin Roosevelt didn't even get to enjoy victory in Europe. Roosevelt had a stroke and died. His new vice president, he had a brand new vice president for the fourth term. So this guy was only in there for a couple months, Harry Truman, and had to take over the reins. Truman was so new to things that he wasn't even aware that there was this top secret project called the Manhattan Project, where the United States was trying to develop an atomic weapon, a nuclear weapon. And you get some jokes here about the Manhattan Project, everyone's favorite, Home Alone 2, the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project by the Sea, that was a sad one. And then everyone's favorite Marvel movie, Iron Manhattan Project. So there's been a lot of movies about the Manhattan Project in the past, and you might even remember this oldie but goodie, Home Improved Manhattan Project. It's a classic 90s sitcom. So the Manhattan Project, this was our U.S. research project to develop a nuclear weapon. Once again, Truman, as vice president, wasn't even in a position where they had let him in on this confidential project. That's how top secret it was. So after VE Day, we had some thinking to do. Would we continue to engage the Japanese on the ground? Or would we continue to develop this Manhattan Project? And if we were able to develop an atomic bomb, would we use that against the Japanese instead of launching some kind of land invasion, like a D-Day style invasion of Japan? We set up something during the war called the War Production Board, and the War Production Board kind of similar to the Defense Production Act that you're seeing with coronavirus. The United States would decide which industries would be taken over by the government and converted over to wartime production. You can see inside a Ford plant during World War II, Ford was given orders to stop making cars, and they were mainly manufacturing airplanes for the Air Force, fighter jets at this point. Another step that was taken was the United States ration goods. So anything that could be used to help with the war effort. You need a lot of typewriters for war correspondence over in Europe. So those were rationed to the public. Gasoline, footwear, heating oil, cars, metals, rubbers, food, and plastics. So anything that was either needed for the war effort or things that were in short supply because of the war effort were rationed, meaning you were only able to get so much of it. We've seen this with coronavirus. They were rationing rubbing alcohol, toilet paper. They're rationing certain types of meats because there's meat shortages due to meat plants closing down because of coronavirus outbreaks. So we're seeing the same kind of thing happen today. And these are what ration stamps would look like. So during World War II, each family would get mailed a certain number of ration stamps that could buy you a certain type of product. And once your stamps were up, that was it. So you would have to use them wisely. So that's it. If anyone has any questions, please email me. We'll plan on possibly having a live class on Wednesday. I'll get back to you about that. Have a good week.